Hey everyone, today we are going to be talking about environmental laws, regulations, and acts. So there's only about 10 to 15 that you have to know for the AP exam, and this year I'm just covering these bases in case they say provide an environmental law that you could use to do this or something like that. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act. So this is going to be the one that creates the Environmental Protection Agency. This was passed in the 1970s when Richard Nixon was president. So Richard Nixon is one of the best presidents for the environment because he creates the EPA, he creates the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and all those other different environmental legislations. So what this NEPA does is it requires, if you're going to use federal money for something, it requires you to do an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. So an environmental assessment is where you go out and you say, okay, if I'm going to use federal money for this, I have to include the impacts on the environment. So what's going to happen to the environment if I build this new highway, or if I build, something like new power lines, and I'm going to use federal money for that. If I find that there's not going to be that much damage to the environment, then the government may let me get away with doing environmental assessment, which is only about 10 pages long. The environmental impact statement, on the other hand, is going to be the one that's extremely long, and it requires you to hire all these outside consulting agencies, and it requires you to do a ton of different things. So the environmental assessment here is going to be the shorter version of this environmental impact statement. And the environmental impact statement would most likely be 100 pages or more. So here's kind of the NEPA process. So if you're going to use federal money to do something, to build something or do anything, what you're going to do, it says, are environmental effects likely to be significant? If you say no, then you could get this thing called a categorical exclusion. And the categorical exclusion just fast tracks you onto using the federal money. If they say yes, you may get away with an environmental assessment. So if you do this study and you have a finding of no significant impact, or a FONSI, I know, right? A FONSI, then you can get away with doing environmental assessment. If you do find that there's going to be significant damage to the environment, then you're going to have to do this environmental impact statement. And again, this environmental impact statement is going to be really intense, really long, and you're going to have to hire outside agencies. So let's talk about the Clean Air Act. So the Clean Air Act began as the Air Pollution Control Act, and this is 1955, and then it turned into the Clean Air Act in 1963. So what this did is, we've talked about the 6 criteria air pollutants before. Remember, lead, carbon monoxide, NOx or nitrogen oxides, particulates, ozone, and then sulfur dioxide. So what this does is it sets the national ambient air quality standards for primary and secondary pollutants. So remember, the secondary pollutant is only going to be ozone. So these primary and secondary groups are, the primary groups are going to be people that, they have asthma, or they have some sort of underlying health issue, like you have heart disease. The secondary groups are going to be people like normal human people or animals and things like that. So what this does is every day they take measurements in a city or in a general vicinity or a general area, and they either categorize you into one of two things: attainment areas versus non-attainment areas. So if you meet the air quality standards for all 6 of those, then you are an attainment area. If you are a non-attainment area, then we're going to have a problem, because the non-attainment areas means that you don't meet the standards that the United States EPA has set. And what you want to do is after you have been a non-attainment area for so long, then you have to have some sort of improvement plan or some written plan on how you're going to plan to meet those air quality standards. All right, so the Clean Air Act is going to establish the NAAQS, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and it also sets up the 6 criteria air pollutants. All right, let's talk about the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act it started out as the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, and what it basically says is they want to restore the integrity of the nation's waters by protecting them. And it mentions specifically point and non-point solution. And non-point is going to be where it comes from a certain, like 5 or 6 different places. It's coming from too many places to pinpoint one general place. Point sources are going to be where you can pinpoint where it's coming from, like, oh, it's coming from that sewage treatment plant. So all waters that have a significant nexus to navigable waters are covered underneath the Clean Water Act. And these two terms are actually very vague. And a lot of people have taken the EPA to court over to, say, well, is this a significant nexus? Is this a navigable water? And since it's so broad, the EPA a lot of times loses the battle against these things. It sets water quality standards, but groundwater is not included in this Clean Water Act. So back when they launched this in the 1940s and then the 1970s, groundwater they assumed was going to be underneath like the common law. And when I say common law, I mean things like if you own the land above it, then you own it, and other laws. So this next one is called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES. So what this does is this is a part of the Clean Water Act. So this is in 1972. And what it does is it basically says that if you're going to discharge some sort of pollutant into a navigable water, then you have to have a permit for that. And the permit, you're going to have to apply to the EPA, and there's a certain amount that you can emit into a navigable water. The permits, you have to apply for them, and then usually it takes about a month or two for the EPA to approve them. But let's say that you are not approved and you still discharge it into some sort of chemical or something into the water. The first offense, the minimum fine is $2,500. The second offense is $50,000 for every day that you're in breach. So let's say you discharge pollutants for like a week from your electroplating facility or something, then you're gonna be in trouble. This plant where my dad used to work, they had a permit, but they let the permit expire, and they were discharging chromium into a stream or a river near where he worked, and they were fined $250,000. But that was basically because they were in non-compliance for 5 days. You can also be sued by individuals who have drank the water or who have waded in the water and gotten sick because you have knowingly endangered the health of someone else. All right, let's also talk about stormwater runoff. So stormwater runoff is actually really interesting because it's kind of the whole tragedy of the commons kind of thing. So what is stormwater though? Stormwater is water that runs off the ground, roads, parking lot after maybe a heavy rainfall. Most of the time it drains directly into streams like lakes, rivers, or it can really go into the grates or the stormwater drains. Most of the time when it goes into the stormwater drains, it doesn't go to a wastewater treatment plant. It just goes back to wherever it came from. So if you have like a parking lot and someone's car has been leaking oil or it's been leaking gas, and then you have a giant flooding event, all the water just washes all those pollutants back into the stormwater drain, and then they go into your streams, your lakes, your rivers, and you wind up drinking that. So this is a really big issue in urban areas because they have so much that has been covered by pavement. And one way to prevent this is to use something called pervious pavement. And pervious pavement is where you have pavement that has tiny little holes in it or tiny little pores, and the water can actually seep into the soil that's underneath the pavement instead of washing across it. So that's one way to deal with stormwater runoff in urban areas. So stormwater in the Clean Water Act, stormwater pollution was not included in the original Clean Water Act. But then in the late 1980s, the EPA is going to impose restrictions on the industrial stormwater. So let's say that you have an industry and you have some giant parking lot, or you have a giant contamination zone where water flows across it and then it picks up stuff and then goes into your lakes, rivers, and streams. So residential areas are not included in this in this amendment to the Clean Water Act. How do you decrease stormwater and urban runoff? You can use pervious pavement again. You can plant green spaces. You can use green roofs. If you don't have as many cars, you don't need as much paved roads or as much pavement. People could increase their use of public transportation. I have a feeling that the stormwater might possibly be on the AP exam this year, but I'm not sure because they haven't ever asked about it. All right, let's talk about the Safe Drinking Water Act. The Safe Drinking Water Act, this is the one that sets the maximum contaminant levels. So if you remember back when we did the water quality lab, we talked about how every pollutant that is in a water has this thing called a maximum contaminant level or a maximum contaminant load. And what it is the upper limit for what concentration can be in your water. For example, lead used to be like 5 parts per billion, and people wanted to decrease it down to 1 part per billion. But then everyone complained, all the water treatment places complained because they said there's no way that we can get down to 1 parts per billion of lead because lead just naturally occurs. So after going back and forth, they decided that 5 will be enough. So every year, your water, whatever you get your water, water suppliers are required to tell you what's in it, like the average concentration over a 365-day period. If you're deemed not be in compliance, the EPA is going to come out and either sue you or try to help you develop some sort of compliance plan or attainment plan. Most of the time, if you are out in the Midwest and you have a lot of fertilizers and fertilizer runoff, your levels for nitrates and phosphates are going to be off the charts. All right, so now that we've talked all about water and air, notice that there is no Soil Act. Like there's no Clean Soil Act, which I find very interesting because soil can be contaminated just as much as water and air, and then it gets into our food and kind of nasty to think about. Okay, so let's talk about the RCRA. We've talked about this one before when we talked about dealing with hazardous waste. So RCRA is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and it was passed in 1976. Mostly this is due to the creation of hazardous waste, like at nuclear power plants, Love Canal. Remember when they were burying that waste underground? So what this does is this gives the EPA the authority to control hazardous waste from the cradle to the grave. And the cradle to the grave just means that when it was created versus where it's stored. So remember, hazardous waste includes anything that is flammable, has chemicals in it, like remember batteries are considered hazardous waste. There is a 1986 amendment that allows the EPA to address environmental problems from storing hazardous waste underground. So like nuclear waste, if you store it underground and then it leaks out, there is an amendment to let the EPA address those problems, like in Hanford, Washington, where nuclear waste leaked out and gave people thyroid cancer, or at the Savannah River site where a lot of people have gotten sick from drinking the water there. So this next one is CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Control and Liability Act. More commonly, this is known as Superfund, and we've talked about Superfund before when we talked about waste. So what this is let's say that you run some sort of chemical company or an oil company, and you go bankrupt, you go out of business. Well, now you've got all this soil and all this water that you have to clean up, but since you have no more money and you went out of business, then you're like, whatever, I'll just leave it there. So this allows the EPA or the government to have this fund called Superfund, and it cleans up hazardous waste sites. There is also this portion of it called EPCRA, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know. And this basically is just saying that if there are toxic chemicals being used in your community, you have a right to know in case of some sort of emergency. And if you were interested in that, you can actually go on there and look up what types of chemicals are being used in your community, because you have a right to know. The only loophole to this is that if it is a trade secret, and I'm using quotes here, trade secret, because if it's a trade secret, then they have a copyright or a patent pending on it, and they don't have to tell you what's in it, which seems like a bunch of nonsense to me. So let's go on and talk about the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act is created in 1973. And what this is doing is this is creating conservation efforts for things that are either threatened or endangered. And most of the time what this does is this is trying to save their habitat. A lot of times, or most of the time, when an animal or a plant is going extinct or it's threatened, it's because humans or something else is destroying its habitat or where it lives. So there are approximately 2,300 species that are listed as endangered or threatened. And when they are listing a species as threatened or endangered, you can also designate like what is their critical habitat. What do we absolutely have to protect in order for them to not go extinct? And if you want to watch a funny video, this is The Simpsons when they find a screamapillar on their property, and it's actually an endangered species, and they have to protect it by law, by federal law. So let's say that you're protesting something, and you want to shut down production of something. Like they're building a housing development, and you don't want that. If you can find an endangered species on that property, no matter how small it is, like maybe it's a worm or something that no one's ever heard of, you can actually shut down the construction or whatever they're doing until they come up with some sort of plan to deal with this endangered species. And a lot of times, on the AP exam, if they ask you, how can you protect this species or how can you save this species habitat, you can try to get one of the species in that area labeled as an endangered species. The federal government will step in to protect it. All right, let's talk about this next one. This next one is called CITES, and I talked about this one a little bit in the one about fisheries. So CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and this is an international agreement that says that countries will not trade species that are endangered or their survival is threatened and things like that. And there are 3 different appendices here. So this one here is going to be Appendix 1. This one is the threatened with extinction, and this is the greatest level of protection. So as you see, as you go down here, Appendix 2, this is a little bit less protection, and then Appendix 3, So 931 species are in Appendix 1. And this includes things like gorillas, sea turtles, and other things that are really about to go extinct in the wild. So if you want to use this one on the AP exam, you'll have to have some sort of question that says, how can you prevent the sale or the trading of endangered species? Then you could use this one. And you can use this as an acronym. The people on the AP exam, the AP readers, should know what CITES is. All right, next one is called TSCA. And TSCA is the Toxic Substances Control Act. And back in the 1970s, again, people are really worried about all these toxic chemicals. And all these toxic chemicals are coming from labs. And this law states that the EPA has the right or the responsibility to protect the public from injury from these chemicals. It regulates the sale and manufacture of chemicals. And what's really interesting about this is that whenever it was passed into agreement, 62,000 chemicals were grandfathered in because they were already being used when TSCA was created. And they said, okay, well, we'll just generally, kind of assume that they're safe, when in actuality they could be or they could not be. And I'm going to talk about generally recognized as safe here in a second. Here are the ones that have been banned permanently in the United States. PCB stands for polychlorinated biphenyls. They were an industrial chemical. Asbestos, they were in like ceiling tiles. Dioxins are also known as TCDD. They can give all kinds of terrible health effects, most likely cancer. Hexavalent chromium, and then CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons. All right, the next one is going to be known as FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. So this is 1970s again. And what this does is this basically says you can't use an insecticide for something other than what it was intended to use for. So if you use that fire ant killer to kill some mosquitoes, or you use it to kill some worms, then technically you are in breach of this federal law and someone could come arrest you. Who's going to come arrest you? I don't know. Only a few pesticides are made available to the public, and you have to have a certain license to buy some of them. Which brings me to this question that I always have. I hear this store on the radio that says, "Come get your own, pest products," and I'm wondering, how are they just selling them to the general public? It seems odd, because don't you have to have a certain law or a certain license to dispense these pesticides? Who knows? So, anyways. This one forces chemical companies to show that their products have no unintended consequences or side effects. And this is usually done by using those bioassays. Remember the bioassays we talked about is where you get the LD50 and all those different things. All right, my last one here is going to be the Delaney Clause of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So this Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was back in the 1970s. And what happened was they said, okay, if there are any food additives or things that we're adding to foods, they have to be recognized as safe. And most substances added to food are GRAS, or GRAS, generally recognized or regarded as safe. So one interesting thing about this act is actually that all things are considered safe unless they are proven to not be safe, which seems kind of backwards in my opinion. And this only applies to about 400 of the 2,700 substances that we know are found in chemicals. And tons of places around the world have recognized that there are so many food additives and so many like drink additives that tons of them need to be either examined in the first place or need to be reevaluated. So if you ever hear people say, you know, don't drink that, it's got red dye number, whatever, this is what they're trying to say, that they are not safe, but they're generally recognized as safe until someone proves them not to be. Okay, so that was it for this one. And as a treat for, you know, listening or paying attention, I'm going to show you a close-up of my dog here. This is Bo. He's very sleepy today for some reason. Bo, why are you so sleepy today? He's very giant, if you can't tell. And he's got his own pillow here, so there you go. Anywho, hope you enjoyed this video. Have a great day.